out of my house! You barren woman!
She gave them 7 years. 7 years of love, loyalty, and silent suffering. 7 years hoping they would finally see her worth. They never did. They called her useless. They handed her a suitcase. They let guards escort her into the pouring rain, like she was nothing. And the man she had trusted, her husband, looked away. She walked out alone. Broken. Invisible. Then, as she lifted her eyes through the rain, she saw him. Her husband. Standing in the doorway, holding another woman. The betrayal cut deeper than the storm around her. But someone else had been watching. A Korean Mafia boss. Seeing what they had thrown away. Seeing something rare. Something valuable. The night they discarded her was the night Amara Johnson's real life began. Amara Johnson had learned a long time ago how to make herself small. She had learned how to walk quietly through the marble hallways of the Park Mansion, how to speak softly at dinner, how to smile through conversations that were designed to remind her she did not fully belong. She had learned how to absorb the sharp glances from her mother-in-law, how to excuse the coldness of the staff, and how to convince herself, night after night, that things would get better. She had given this family 7 years. 7 years of her youth, her energy, her identity. She had left behind her family in America, her friendships, the version of herself that used to laugh without calculating how it would be received. She had studied Korean until she could speak it fluently. She had dressed the way they wanted, attended every function they required, and represented the park name with more dignity than most of them deserved. And all of it, every single sacrifice, every silent compromise, had never been enough. Because to Mrs. Park, Amara was not a daughter-in-law. She was not a partner to her son. She was not even a person with feelings worthy of consideration. She was a function, a role. And the role had one requirement above everything else: an heir. Amara sat in the back of the private car as it returned from the hospital, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing streets of Seoul. The city was beautiful in the late afternoon light, all glass towers and golden reflections, people moving through their lives completely unaware of the weight sitting in her chest. The doctor's words were still settling into her bones. Still no change. Still no pregnancy. Still the same answer she had been carrying home for years, each time feeling heavier than the last. She had stopped crying about it on the way home from hospitals. She had used up those tears a long time ago. Now she just felt the silence. Mrs. Park was already waiting when Amara arrived at the mansion. That was never a good sign. The older woman stood in the center of the main hall, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, her hands clasped in front of her like she was presiding over a business meeting rather than dismantling a human being. 3 members of the household staff stood nearby. Nobody had been dismissed. Amara understood immediately that this was intentional. Whatever was about to happen, Mrs. Park wanted witnesses. Well, Mrs. Park's voice was calm, almost pleasant. Another visit. Another failure. Amara stood straight. She had learned not to flinch. The doctors are still running tests, Amara said quietly. There are other options we haven't fully explored yet. I would like for Daniel and I to speak with a specialist who. 7 years. Mrs. Park cut her off without raising her voice. She did not need to. The words themselves carried enough weight. 7 years in this house. 7 years of patience from this family. And you stand there talking about specialists. I am still his wife. Amara said it firmly, because it was still true, and because she needed to hear herself say it. Mrs. Park looked at her then. Really looked at her. And what Amara saw in that gaze was not hatred. It was something colder than hatred. It was indifference. Complete and total indifference, the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they have finally decided to replace. You are useless to this family. Mrs. Park said it the way someone reads a fact from a document. No anger. No cruelty for the sake of cruelty. Just a verdict. I want her removed, she said, turning to the guard standing near the door. Pack what is necessary. She leaves tonight. Amara turned. Daniel was standing at the top of the staircase. He had been there the entire time. She looked up at him, and in that moment she put everything into that look. 7 years of love, of hope, of holding on. She put the memory of every good night they had shared, every promise he had made her, every time she had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. She gave him all of it in that one moment, silently asking him to finally choose her. He looked down at the floor and said nothing. 20 minutes later, Amara stood outside the mansion gates. The rain had started without warning, heavy and cold, soaking through her coat within seconds. She had one suitcase, one bag over her shoulder, and the quiet, devastating knowledge that the life she had built here was completely gone. She began to walk slowly, because she had nowhere urgent to be and no idea where she was going. The street was empty and the rain kept falling, and she was so tired that even the grief felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Then she stopped. She turned back. Just once. Just to look. The lights in Daniel's bedroom were already on, and through the rain-streaked window, in the warm glow of the room she used to share with him, she could see the silhouette of her husband with his arms around another woman. The betrayal did not arrive as a scream. It arrived as a silence so deep it swallowed everything. Because in that moment Amara understood something she had been too hopeful to accept for a very long time. She had not just been thrown out tonight. She had been replaced long before tonight. She turned away from the window. She turned away from the mansion, from the lights, from the 7 years she would never get back. She pulled her suitcase forward and walked into the rain with her head down and her heart in pieces. She did not see the black car parked at the end of the street. Not yet. The rain did not let up. It fell in heavy sheets across the empty street, bouncing off the pavement, filling the gutters, turning the city lights into long blurred streaks of gold and white. Amara walked through it without hurrying. There was no point in hurrying. She had no destination, no plan, and no person in this city she could call at this hour without feeling the shame of having to explain what had just happened to her. She had her phone in her bag. She had thought about calling her mother 3 times already. But every time she reached for it, she imagined her mother's voice, warm and worried, asking questions Amara was not yet strong enough to answer. So she kept walking, one foot in front of the other. The suitcase rolling behind her over the wet pavement, its small wheels loud in the silence of the empty road. She was shaking, though she was not sure anymore whether it was from the cold or from everything else. The rain had soaked through her coat completely. Her hair was pressed flat against her face. She must have looked like a woman unraveling, because that was exactly what she was. 7 years of careful composure coming apart one step at a time on a dark street in Seoul, with no one around to see it and no one coming to help. Or so she thought. She heard the car before she saw it. A low, quiet engine. The kind of sound that belonged to something expensive and unhurried. She did not look up at first. She kept walking, pulling her suitcase a little closer, the way a woman alone at night learns to do automatically. But the car did not pass her. It slowed. And then it stopped, rolling gently to the curb just ahead of her, its black body gleaming under the streetlights like something pulled from a different world entirely. Amara stopped walking. The car sat there for a moment. Just long enough for uncertainty to settle over her. Then the rear door opened. She could not see clearly through the rain at first. Just the interior light of the car catching the edge of a dark suit. Then the figure stepped out and the light found his face, and Amara felt something shift in the air around her, something she could not immediately name. He was tall, sharply dressed in all black, the kind of clothing that did not apologize for itself. His face was composed and still, the way certain men look when they have long since stopped being affected by things that would unsettle anyone else. He was not old, but there was a weight behind his eyes that came from living a very particular kind of life. He reached back into the car without looking away from her and produced an umbrella, opening it in one clean motion before stepping toward her and holding it over her head. The rain stopped hitting her face. Amara stared at him. She did not know what to say. She was not even sure she trusted what was happening, because nothing about this night had made sense and she had already been broken in more ways than she had words for. He studied her for a moment. Not the way men sometimes look at women, measuring and calculating. He looked at her the way someone looks at something they already understand, like he had already done the math before he stepped out of the car. "You are Amara Johnson." His voice was low and even. It was not a question. She blinked. "You know who I am." "I know who you are," he said simply. "I know who your husband is. I know who his mother is. And I know exactly what just happened inside that house tonight." The words landed quietly, but they landed hard. She searched his face for something threatening, some reason to step back and walk away. But there was nothing predatory in his expression. There was something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like he had expected to find her exactly here, exactly like this, and had decided long before tonight what he would do about it. "My name is Kon Jae-min," he said. "And I have been watching the Park family for quite some time." The name moved through her slowly. She had heard it before. Everyone in certain circles in Seoul had heard it. Kon Jae-min was not the kind of name people said casually. He existed in whispered conversations and carefully averted eyes. He was the kind of man the Park family would smile at in public and fear in private. The kind of man whose patience, when it finally ran out, had consequences that could not be undone. And he was standing in the rain, holding an umbrella over her head, looking at her like she mattered. "Why are you here?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it simply, without drama, without performance. Just the truth delivered plainly, the way she had not been spoken to in a very long time. "They threw away something valuable tonight." He held her gaze as he said it. "And I do not believe in letting valuable things go to waste." Amara felt something crack open in her chest. Not in a painful way. In the way that happens when something that has been shut for too long finally gets air. She did not cry. She was past tears for the night. But she felt the weight of those words settle into her in a way she was not prepared for. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain drummed against the umbrella above them. The street remained empty. Behind her, somewhere up that long driveway, her husband was holding another woman in a lit room, and the life she had spent 7 years building was already being cleared away like it had never existed. Ahead of her was nothing. No plan. No safety. No idea what morning would look like. And then there was this. A man standing in the rain, offering her shelter, telling her she was worth something on the worst night of her life. Jae-min tilted his head slightly toward the open car door. "Come with me," he said quietly. "I will explain everything. And then the choice will be yours." Amara looked at the car. She looked at him. She thought about the window. The silhouette. The arms that had held someone else before she had even made it to the end of the street. She picked up her suitcase. And she got in. The deal was simple. At least on the surface. Jae-min laid it out for her that same night, in a quiet room at the top of a building that overlooked the entire city. Tea was brought without being asked for. The rain continued outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, softer now, the city below glittering through the water like something from a dream. Amara sat across from him with her hands wrapped around the warm cup and listened to everything he said without interrupting. The Park family owed Kon Jae-min a great deal of money. Not the kind of debt that gets discussed over dinner or settled with a phone call. The kind of debt that had been buried under layers of paperwork and false agreements and handshakes made in rooms where nothing was ever written down. Daniel's father had borrowed heavily from Jae-min's organization years ago, using connections and promises as collateral, and when the old man died he had passed the debt to his family along with everything else. Only the family had chosen to pretend the debt did not exist, because that was what the Park family did with things they found inconvenient. They pretended. They ignored. They discarded. Jae-min had been patient. He had watched and waited and built his case quietly, the way he did everything. But patience had a limit, and that limit had arrived. He was going to dismantle the Park family's reputation, their finances, and their standing in Seoul society. He was going to do it methodically and completely. And when it was done, there would be nothing left of the empire they had used to make people like Amara feel small. What he needed from her was presence. The Park family knew Jae-min as a business threat. What they did not know was how much he knew about them. If Amara stood beside him publicly, it would send a message that would shake them before the real damage even began. It would tell them that the woman they had humiliated had not disappeared quietly the way they expected. It would tell them that she had landed somewhere they could not have anticipated. And it would rattle them, because rattled people made mistakes, and mistakes were exactly what Jae-min needed them to make. In return, he would provide her with security, resources, and the satisfaction of watching the people who broke her face the consequences of what they had done. Amara listened to all of it. Then she set down her cup. "You do not need me for this," she said. "You have enough without me." Jae-min looked at her with something close to appreciation. "You are correct," he said. "But I want you there. What they did tonight deserves a witness. Specifically, you." She agreed that same night. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Amara had experienced in her 7 years in Seoul. Jae-min's world operated on its own logic, its own rhythm, its own rules. It was not a gentle world, but it was an honest one, at least with her. Nobody in his circle spoke to her with the quiet condescension she had grown used to in the Park household. Nobody looked through her or around her. She was introduced as someone worthy of respect, and that introduction was taken seriously by everyone who received it. She was given space to breathe, to sleep without tension coiled in her chest, to eat without watching how she was being watched. Small things that she had forgotten were supposed to be normal. Jae-min himself was not what she had expected. He was careful with her in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. He did not push. He did not demand more than what their agreement required. When she needed silence, he gave her silence. When she wanted to talk, he listened without looking at his phone or glancing toward the door. He was present in a way Daniel had not been for years, possibly ever, and Amara tried not to think too much about what that meant. She had other things to focus on. The charity gala was held on a Friday evening in one of Seoul's most prestigious hotels. It was exactly the kind of event the Park family lived for. The kind of room where their names still carried weight, where people still smiled at them with genuine warmth, where the cracks in their foundation were not yet visible to anyone on the outside. Mrs. Park had already confirmed her attendance. Daniel would be there with his new companion, the woman from the window, now being introduced in careful language to their social circle as a close friend. Amara stood in front of the mirror in the suite Jae-min had arranged for her and barely recognized herself. Not because she had been transformed into someone unrecognizable, but because the woman looking back at her was someone she remembered from a long time ago. Before Seoul. Before the Park family. Before 7 years of making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what she should be. The gown was deep emerald, structured at the shoulders, elegant without asking for attention. Her hair was swept up. Her posture was straight. Her eyes were clear. She looked like a woman who had decided something. Jae-min was waiting when she came downstairs. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he offered his arm. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And she meant it completely. The gala was already full when they arrived. The kind of full that hums with conversation and string music and the particular social electricity of people performing their best versions of themselves. Heads turned as they entered, because Kang Jae-min walking into any room changed the atmosphere of that room, and the woman on his arm was someone nobody had expected to see. Amara kept her eyes forward. She heard the shift before she saw it. A ripple in the conversations nearest the door. The sound of recognition moving through the crowd in waves, quiet but unmistakable. She did not search for the Park family. She did not need to. She simply walked beside Jae-min and let herself be seen. Then she heard it. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere to her left. She turned her head. Daniel stood approximately 15 feet away, a glass in his hand, his new companion at his side. He looked exactly the same as he always had, polished and composed, the kind of man who wore his privilege like a second skin, but the composure was gone now. His face had drained of color so completely that even across the room, even in the soft lighting of a hotel ballroom, the change was visible. Beside him, Mrs. Park stood rigid. Her eyes moved from Amara to Jae-min and back again, and something passed through her expression that Amara had never seen on that face before. Fear. Not embarrassment. Not irritation. Fear. Because Mrs. Park understood exactly who Kang Jae-min was. And she understood, in the way that people who have spent their lives calculating power understand things, what it meant that this man had chosen to walk into this room with the woman they had thrown into the rain. Amara did not smile at them. She did not need to. She simply held their gaze for one long, unhurried moment. Long enough to let them feel it. Long enough to let them understand that she was not broken, that she was not hiding, and that the storm they had sent her out into had carried her somewhere they could not follow. Then she turned back to the room and continued forward. Because she had not come here for them. She had come here for herself. And the woman they had discarded was just getting started. Nobody dismantles an empire overnight. But Kang Jae-min was not in a hurry. He had built his patience the same way he had built everything else in his life, carefully, quietly, and with absolute certainty about where it was all going. He had waited years for the right moment to move against the Park family, and now that the moment had arrived he moved through it with the kind of precision that left no room for recovery. It began with the finances. The debt the Park family had buried came back to the surface with documentation that could not be disputed and witnesses that could not be pressured into silence. Legal proceedings were filed quietly at first and then not so quietly. The kind of lawyers that Jae-min employed did not lose, and the Park family quickly discovered that the connections they had relied on for decades were considerably less loyal when faced with the alternative of standing beside a sinking ship. Then came the scandals. Things that had been carefully managed for years began to surface. Business arrangements that existed only on paper. Properties acquired through pressure rather than transaction. Partnerships that had been built on threats disguised as opportunities. Each revelation arrived in the press with the timing of someone who knew exactly which stone to turn over and exactly when to turn it. The Park name, once spoken in Seoul with a particular kind of automatic deference, began to carry a different weight entirely. People who had smiled at Mrs. Park for years stopped returning her calls. Invitations dried up. Doors that had always opened closed. The social world the Park family had spent generations constructing turned out to be far more fragile than it appeared, because it had been built on the assumption that their power was permanent. And permanent power, as they were now learning, was an illusion that only held as long as nobody decided to test it. Daniel tried twice to reach Amara through intermediaries. The first time she did not respond. The second time she had Jae-min's legal team send a reply that made clear, in precise and formal language, that any further attempts at contact would be treated as harassment. She felt nothing particular when she was told about it. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the quiet that comes after a very long noise finally stops. Through all of it, Jae-min remained steady beside her. Their arrangement had begun as strategy. Two people with aligned interests moving together toward a shared goal. That was how it had been framed, and that was how Amara had accepted it, because after what Daniel had done to her heart she had needed things to be practical and clear and defined. She had needed to know exactly what something was before she allowed herself to feel it. But life has a way of moving past the boundaries people set for it. It happened in small moments rather than one large one. The morning she came downstairs unable to sleep and found Jae-min already awake, sitting at the window with a book, and the way he looked up at her and simply made space for her to sit nearby without requiring conversation or explanation. The evening she cried, finally and completely, all the grief she had been holding back for years releasing itself without warning, and the way he sat with her through it without trying to fix it or rush past it. The afternoon she laughed, genuinely and freely, at something he said, and the way he looked at her afterward as though that sound was something he intended to hear for the rest of his life. She noticed the shift before she named it, and when she finally named it she was not afraid of it, because this feeling, whatever it was becoming, did not ask her to be smaller. It did not come with conditions or measurements or the constant low hum of not being enough. It felt like being seen clearly by someone who had looked directly at her from the beginning and had never once looked away. One evening, sitting across from him over dinner in the quiet of his home, she said it simply. I think I have been falling in love with you for a while now. Jae-min set down his glass. He looked at her with those steady eyes that had watched her from the beginning and said, just as simply, I know. I have been waiting for you to catch up. She laughed. And he smiled. And something settled between them that night that neither of them needed to negotiate or define. The news came on an otherwise ordinary morning. Amara stood in the bathroom holding the test with both hands, her heart doing something she could not immediately categorize. After years of hospital visits and diagnoses and the particular grief of wanting something and being told your body would not cooperate, the result in front of her felt surreal. She stood there for a long time before she moved. Before she walked out into the hallway and found Jae-min and put the test in his hands without saying anything. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. And Kang Jae-min, a man who had faced things in his life that would have leveled most people, looked genuinely undone. Not in a frightening way. In the way that happens when something you had stopped allowing yourself to hope for arrives without warning and the defenses you did not even know you were carrying simply fall away. He pulled her close and held her and did not say anything for a long time. He did not need to. Their daughter was born on a morning in early spring when the city was just beginning to warm and the cherry blossoms along the boulevard outside the hospital were 2 days away from opening. They named her Soli, a name they had chosen together, sitting up late one night with a list between them, laughing and disagreeing and finally agreeing in the way that people do when they are building something real. Soli grew into herself quickly and loudly and with a certainty about her own presence in the world that made both her parents stop and smile regularly. She had Amara's eyes and Jae-min's stillness and a laugh that belonged entirely to herself. She moved through their home like she owned it, which she did, in every way that mattered. On a Sunday afternoon in late summer, Amara sat on the steps of the garden watching Soli chase something small and determined through the grass, her small feet quick and her focus absolute. Jae-min came and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and handed her a cup of tea without being asked. Amara looked at her daughter. She looked at the garden, at the warm light moving through the trees, at the life around her that was full and quiet and entirely her own. She thought about a rainy street, a suitcase, a window lit up in the dark with a silhouette that had broken something in her she thought would never heal. She thought about a black car pulling up beside her, an umbrella appearing above her head, a voice saying she was something valuable. She had spent 7 years in the wrong life believing it was the only life available to her. She had shrunk herself down to fit inside someone else's expectations and called it love and called it loyalty and held on long past the point where holding on made any sense. And then one night the door had closed behind her and the rain had come down and the worst thing she had ever survived had turned out to be the beginning of everything. She leaned her head gently against Jae-min's shoulder. Soli found whatever she had been chasing and held it up triumphantly, turning to show her parents with a grin so wide it took up most of her face. Amara smiled back at her daughter. Her real daughter. The one the Park family had told her she would never have. The one who existed precisely because one woman had been brave enough, or desperate enough, or simply tired enough, to get into a black car on a rainy night and choose something different. She closed her eyes for just a moment and let the afternoon settle around her. The night they threw her out, they thought they were ending her story. They had only just begun it.